and then based on that, the developers or we'll actually create the tangible experience. But the testing that we do talk about will be kind of once the development team kind of creates like a tangible usable version, say if it's an alpha or a beta, then these testing principles also apply to that, because they don't just apply to prototyping. So a bit about testing, just also to help us remind ourselves of what we said. What we said was helpful about prototyping is that it's all about learning. It de-risks your idea. You really want to replicate the real environment. I think a lot of researchers and designers kind of get stuck asking people to imagine they're in a specific situation. In my experience, like asking people to imagine themselves in a situation, people aren't very good at imagining themselves in a situation. So what's much better is to actually have them in the situation and then test with them there. And another thing is that we need to observe what people do, not what they say. People often kind of be nice to you because they think you wanna hear specific answers, but their body language and the way they express themselves will often give you a more accurate picture of what they're thinking. So there's a few different types of testing here. These aren't all of them. Contextual inquiries are basically, it's less about testing and more about actually like understanding the problem or seeing how your idea could work and testing your idea. So contextual inquiries where you actually go to someone's home or the environment that you think they encounter this problem in, whether it's workplace or home or their car or whatever, and you actually do the research with them there, and you kind of ask them to show you how they would do something, and then that way you get like a real picture of what it looks like on a day-to-day basis. Guerrilla testing is basically where you go to a public place and you just ask people to stop and talk to you for 10-15 minutes about a specific problem. So it's very kind of, very casual, very unplanned. You just choose a day that you think might be good and then go out and test with people in public. Moderated testing is when you're there and often you might be using like a digital prototype and you're kind of walking people through, I want you to test this for me, have a look at that, and they do it and they talk about it. Unmoderated testing is where you just give it to them. They might record themselves. You're not kind of hand holding. You're not present at the moment that they're testing. They just they do it themselves and then give you a recording or give you some feedback. A phone interview is phone interview. So where you call them, you tell them to use the prototype and then walk you through the feedback, but you're not actually present. Card sorting is usually for information architectures. So when you say you want to test the information architecture of a website, or you have some ideas around what the information architecture could look like, that's when you kind of get people to do card sorting, and it's an activity where people use Post-it notes or virtual whiteboards to sort different cards in categories that makes sense to them. Session recording is an interesting one. It's one that came up in the past few years. Basically, it's so there's this tool, for example, called Hotjar, but I'm pretty sure there's a few more where they actually record people using your website or your tool or your product, but it's anonymous, and they show you the recording of how someone is actually using your website. So it's all of a sudden it becomes very real, like this person is actually trying to find information or trying to use your product. So you can watch them kind of go through your website and see how they navigate it, and then the last one there is A/B testing, and that's around like this is a live test in terms of 50% of people will see one version, 50% the other 50% of people will see the other version, and you're testing say conversion, like how often do people click sign up, and you see how your design changes, how that translates in terms of conversion rates. Does that make sense? What do you think? Any questions about that so far?
Yeah, actually, I have a couple of questions.
Yeah, far
Uh,
away.
uh, First question is like what is a minimum minimum kind of prototype which is ready for testing? Like, we have many kind of prototypes, right? Like it should be a low-fi, hi-fi paper prototype. What kind of prototype is actually ready for testing? Uh, that is the first question.
Yeah, that's a good question. In so things people different designers have different philosophies around that. My personal philosophy is that
Yeah,
whatever prototype you have that kind of that you can use to test your core assumptions or your key risks, that's enough to test. It doesn't have to be high fidelity. It can be something pretty low fidelity. But I think as you kind of test more and more, you want to move from low fidelity to high fidelity to kind of iron out any other issues. So I think, yeah, you can test with pretty low fidelity stuff. Like last week when we were talking about prototyping, there was an example of like having a cardboard bag to
yes,
test like specific features. That's pretty low fidelity. It's not actually leather or whatever, but it gets the point across. So if you're testing a specific feature, um, you can use that. But eventually, for example, you want to test like the material, right?
yeah,
So eventually, you'll kind of have to create a bag or a prototype with the material that you're thinking to use and test that. But that test is very different, say, to testing the number of pockets. If that makes sense. Like the cardboard one, you can test the number of pockets or the size,
yeah,
whereas the high fidelity one, you can test things like whether it's waterproof, how heavy it is, and so on and so forth.
yeah. Uh, Thanks for the explanation. One more question is
Yeah.
like you mentioned all this testing. Suppose I want to like improve shopping experience like of some retail or something.
Mm.
So in that sense, all among all this testing, which kind of will be effective, and how to choose that which one is the most effective for my product? Like there are many, but how to know that this one is the most effective one for my product in that context?
Yeah, cool. So often what we'll do is we won't actually rely, like you'll never, between kind of problem framing and coming up with a design, you
Yeah,
probably won't just use one method. You want to use different methods depending um, on the risk. Okay, so for example, if you're trying to improve the shopping experience, right,
yeah,
the first test what you might want to do is you might want to go into a shopping center and talk to people and get them to show what the problems they're facing are, right? And
yeah.
then you might want to do guerrilla testing in terms of just taking a prototype and trying to test it.
Okay.
Uh, and then say you're coming up with like a so so the contextual inquiry potentially might be before you actually have a prototype. Guerrilla testing might be when you have a prototype. And then say you're trying to design your website and you're thinking about what categories you'll have on the website in terms of like what buttons and things. For that you might want to do card sorting. Um, so it really depends on like what the challenge you're facing is and identifying the like what's the challenge we're trying to solve or we're trying to overcome. Okay, what's the best way that we think we can test, or what's the best number of ways that you can mix together. So you can mix and match. It doesn't have to be one or the other.
Uh, Thanks for that. And like, do UX researchers or UX designers do testing, or like some other designated like role is there for the like person who do the testing?
Yeah, that's interesting. So I think probably one of the factors is how big the organization is and how much funding they've got for design. Ideally, you want separation of concerns in terms of having someone design the prototype and someone else test it, because then the researcher or the tester doesn't have a vested interest in the success. They're kind of neutral, and we'll talk a bit more about that. But a lot of times, especially in startups and smaller companies, you'll have someone designing and testing. It's not ideal, uh, but yeah, sometimes you'll have that.
Okay.
Any other questions? Feel free to throw them out.
Thank you.
Cool, awesome. So let's use a Netflix example. So, so how do you think like a contextual inquiry could work in, like, say if you're, responsible for doing some test research and testing around Netflix, how do you think it could work if you want to do a contextual inquiry? A contextual inquiry might be, for example, you go to someone's home, at 6 p.m., the time that they say have dinner and watch Netflix, and you sit with them and see how they use Netflix. So that could be a contextual inquiry in terms of you're going into the person's real environment, you're having a look at how they're really using it during the time, that they would normally use it. Whereas, say, A/B testing, right? You would have like two versions of the home screen on Netflix, and you're seeing, how, like, for example, if you really care about the number of minutes people spend on Netflix before closing it, that might be what you're measuring. So you're trying to design a home screen that maximizes the amount of time people spend on Netflix, because that gets you more money, for example.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Like one more thing is like, what if I want to add some shows as my favorites or something?
Mhm.
Is it a kind of functionality or kind of parameter of whatever you mentioned before?
In terms of A/B testing,
Yeah,
yeah. So say for example, you could do an A/B test, for example, around how quickly it is for someone to find a new show, right?
yeah,
So you're testing a specific pathway in the app, but you have like two different ways. One, for example, is people scrolling, and one is people searching. And
yeah.
yeah, yeah, that's a good example.
Oh, thanks. I got a clarification.
Awesome. So now it's your turn. So I want you to come up with 5 questions to test your prototype. And I want you
Okay.
to start broadly. So start with open questions. All 5 questions should probably be open questions anyway. And then I want you to focus on the biggest risks and assumptions. So have a think about, okay, what are the biggest risks or assumptions that we're thinking about with our idea or prototype? Okay, what questions do we need to ask about that? Awesome. Welcome back. So hopefully you spent that time kind of putting out open questions. So questions like, how, or tell me about the last time you did this, or, when was the last time you did that?
Yes.
Because open questions, like we said, invite conversation, which is really what you want to do when you're prototyping and testing. You don't want to kind of have narrow questions where the answer is yes or no. You want to kind of have a conversation with your potential customer. So here's some guidelines or some guidelines that I've kind of learned and applied around testing your prototype. So when you're testing your prototype, really what you want to do is you want to have a 90 to 10% ratio. So you want to be listening 90% of the times and talking as a researcher or as someone that's doing the testing. You want to be talking 10% of the time, and really that kind of puts it on the person that you're testing with to share their thoughts, and that's why it's important to start broadly, right? So you want to start with open questions and just understand the person's context and how they experience the problem, and kind of get specific around, okay, how have you solved this problem in the past and things like that. You want to ask open questions, and there are some examples there. One tip that I learned early on is, so often what people will do, human beings don't like silence, so they'll try to fill gaps, right? So you might ask a
Yeah.
question, the person that you're testing with might answer, and then there is silence, right? And as researchers, we might be tempted to fill the gap and ask next question. But next time that you're testing, I want you to stay silent just for 10 seconds and watch what happens. Often what will happen is the person that you're testing with will actually share something really insightful. The next one is be neutral. So as much as possible, like we said, if you can, don't be the person. Like the person that's prototyping shouldn't be the one testing, right? Because often when we prototype something, it feels like it's our baby, and we're a bit precious about the feedback that we get. But if you can have a different person that's testing the prototype, that's usually better. Let people that you're testing with contribute ideas. So at the end of the test, or at the end of your session with them, you can ask them, okay, do you have any ideas about how we could improve this, or what type of product would help you? Test with extreme users, right? So for example, I was doing the research on a pretty large website with sort of millions of users, and it's all well and good to kind of test with the usual suspects, people that you think visit your website often. But it's also really important to say test with people who have a disability, or testing with extreme users in the sense that people who need the most from your website or need it to be the most helpful. And that actually helps you improve the experience for everyone else. The last one is the think aloud methodology. So when you're testing, one thing that I often do is I actually ask the person that I'm testing with to sort of, as they're using the prototype, to share their thoughts with me. So I want them to be kind of, saying, oh, okay, right now I'm thinking to click this button, but I'm not really so sure where that button will take me, so maybe I'll click that one, right? Whereas if you don't use that think aloud methodology, all you see is them clicking the second button, and you don't actually get to see that they were thinking about clicking the first, but they didn't because they weren't sure where it was going to take them.
Yeah.
So usually having a sort of rough line of inquiry. A line of inquiry is basically kind of an example is right there in terms of like, here are the key questions that we're going to ask. Tell me a bit about you, for example, and then the prompts. So if the person isn't kind of forthright with their answers and needs a bit of help, a few follow-up questions to help them really answer your question, then you can say, where do you live and work? But the prompts really aren't questions that you have to use. They're more, if the person isn't sort of sharing the information, then you can prompt them to share it by asking those prompts. So tell me about the last time you used this website, or you had a problem with this specific service, or I want you to try to, check out on this website. How would you go about it? So, yeah. And then, so once you've, I think a really important stage is so testing is obviously really important, right? Because there you kind of find out what's happening. Then the next part is really important in terms of actually helping you refine your prototype. And here are some questions that that you can ask yourselves as a researcher or as a team of designers, to help you kind of move forward and refine your prototype. So it could be, okay, what do we know now that we didn't know before? What did people say they liked, or what did people give feedback on? What questions did they have, right? Because questions that people have show you that there's some gap in how you explained the prototype. What ideas did people suggest, or and what will we do next? And often you'll need to actually prioritize the changes that come out of a prototype round. You won't necessarily have time to do all the changes, and you might not have enough money to do it. But yeah, you want to pick sort of the absolute critical pieces of feedback and use them to refine your prototype. Awesome. So this week, I want you to create a line of inquiry for your prototype. I want you to test your prototype with at least 2 people. I want you as a team to reflect on what you learned through that testing and then refine your prototype based on that. And it would be awesome if you can schedule, again, as a team, a check-in with me. So the link is there, but I'll share it on the YouTube channel as well. Just for 30 minutes to talk, how are you progressing? What help do you need, and how can we best support you? So this week is really about, testing your prototype and refining it.
One question, Ram,
Yeah.
regarding the tests, like testing. If I want my prototype to be tested, like how we are doing some small kind of project, so we can find people. But how to find volunteers for doing such stuff? Like I don't think so. Voluntarily, many people they get ready. Then how you approach as a like a big organization, or for a big project, because we require a lot of inputs, especially on the people. I did some Coursera certification and talks about like people usually pay also to
Oh, yeah.
get prototypes tested, or they get some feedback. Then how we can approach people and to find volunteers for testing or this kind of stuff?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think there's a few ways. Yes, often when you're doing it as an organization, you'll need to pay like some sort of incentive, like whether it's $100 or a specific product or a gift card. I think some of the ways is you could reach out to your personal network to kind of like your family and friends, and your friends' families.
Yeah.
Another way is if you've already run a survey, you might have the contact details of some people who'd be happy to do some testing for you. And another way is you could actually just use guerrilla testing. So, it's a bit hard with coronavirus, but if it's safe to do so in your city or the area that you live in, you could go to the nearest shopping mall and just ask a few people. Might take you, say, a couple of hours to get 3 or 4 people, but hopefully you'll find someone. But you'll find someone that's willing to do the testing for you.
Okay. Thank you.
No worries. Is that helpful?
Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. So that's it. That's it for this week, and that's it for the course. But I know obviously the team, not everyone's at the prototyping and testing stage. So for the next few weeks, I'll still have my Calendly open, so you can book time with me, and we'll also have the Slack channel. So feel free to reach out to other teams and to me if you need any help.
Sure.
Awesome. Thanks so much for making the time.